So, this is the last lecture, and we started a little bit of it last time. So, what we concluded based on the last class was that a fundamental, if not the fundamental, problem with most social choice procedures is that they don't incorporate intensity of preference or cardinality of preference. And a natural approach to try to incorporate this is to use some of the externality mechanisms that we had talked about previously, like the Vickrey-Clark-Groves mechanism or the expected externality mechanism. And Miles, what are the fundamental problems that arise with the Vickrey-Clark-Groves mechanism? Yeah. Exactly. VCG has these very extreme collusion problems. And in fact, it also has these problems with that it can run a budget surplus that has to be destroyed. And that budget surplus could, in principle, be a large fraction of the total gains for making the efficient decision, both of which are pretty bad problems with the VCG mechanism. Eben, you're graduating early as well, right? So if you want to do your final project, it should be by Wednesday. And if you don't want to, I'll just grade you on the stuff prior to that, okay? The expected externality mechanism also has some pretty serious problems. Zafan, what were some of those problems?
It's hard to guess expected externality.
Yeah, it's hard to know what people's expected externalities are, absolutely. Neither of these, as a result, really seems like a very practical mechanism. Turns out expected externality also has some major collusion issues as well. Okay, so this sort of leads you to a natural conclusion, which was probably most eloquently stated by Winston Churchill, which is that while democracy is the worst system of government, other than all the other ones that have been tried, and economics adds to this, or that have been proposed, because all these other systems, despite being in principle more efficient, are so disastrously bad along other dimensions that it's probably not worth going in for them. Okay, so what I'm going to try to argue today is that that's true up to this point, but that there's actually a very simple mechanism that solves most of these problems. And it's called quadratic voting. And could somebody explain how it works? Kevin?
I mean, essentially, you are assigned a number of votes that is the square root of the amount you should purchase.
Yeah. So you can choose to pay as much as you want, and you get a number of votes that's equal to the square root of that, and the money that's raised is redistributed back to people. Right? I'm going to use sort of a basic price theory analysis to analyze this. I mean, imagine that there's n symmetric individuals, each of who has a utility ui for getting the outcome, which can be either positive or negative. So they may prefer not to have the alternative implemented, in which case they'll have a negative utility, or to have the alternative implemented, in which case they'll have a positive utility. And let's let capital P be the distribution of the sum of people other than U's votes. So, Connie, in that case, what is going to be person I's expected utility if they buy a number of votes VI? Sorry? Their total expected utility is a function of the number of votes that they buy. That it goes in the positive direction, yeah. Yep. And what's the probability in terms of this cumulative distribution function of the sum of everybody else's votes? Can you tell me what the chance that the vote succeeds is? So this is the chance that the sum of everyone else's votes is below a certain number. 1 minus p of how does it depend on the number of votes that I buy? Yeah, so it's when the sum of all the votes is greater than 0, which is the same as 1 minus the chance that the sum of all the votes is less than 0, right? Which is the same as the sum of everybody else's vote being less than negative the number of votes that you buy, right? So that gives you this, plus something that depends on what everybody else does but not on what you do, and so it's irrelevant to your payoffs. Okay, so Russell, what first order condition does that lead to?
That the marginal cost of a vote is equal to the marginal benefit of a vote.
So, but
Like
yeah,
exactly.
so take a derivative of that.
So you get a so you're choosing so you get a negative or a positive little p of times
Yeah.
u
Yeah?
minus 2b equals 0.
Okay, so maybe rearrange that and solve for a little v.
It's like b equals half something. Yeah, so p.
Well, that's actually fine. Let's just stick with that. So that's fine. Good job, Russell. So p of negative v times u is equal to 2 times v. And this little p is the density associated with this capital P. So we're going to call that the density of pivotality. That's like the chance that by buying epsilon more votes, you change the outcome of the election. Okay, so we can rearrange that to get this first order condition, which is that the number of votes that you buy is proportional to your utility, with the constant of proportionality being p over 2. Now, of course, p is not a constant, right? P depends on the number of votes that you've bought. But the key idea behind this mechanism is that p should not vary much across individuals or across the number of votes that you buy. And that it will behave very much like a market price. When no individual is large, it will be essentially constant. So the intuition here is that, in a large election, Bush winning by 400 votes and Gore winning by 400 votes are essentially both just the election was close to being tied, right? Because there's really no way to distinguish those things. It just comes down to hanging chads at that point, right? And note that efficiency is exactly that everyone's votes are proportional to their utility. Because in that case, the sign of the sum of the votes will be equal to the sign of the sum of the utilities. And so under this system, people are led by an invisible hand to buy votes that are proportional to their utility and therefore to promote social efficiency. Okay, so under this system, who is going to gain and lose relative to majority rule? Lancelot?
You mean, also, like in general, people who are in the majority? Like, do you mean for a specific question or like in general?
Yeah, I mean just in general, yeah.
In general, well, I guess this is going to give more weight to which people. If you don't have a quasi-linearity.
Yeah, yeah. Or just to people, yeah, who are, I mean, people, if it's the minority that's winning, the majority will lose out, right? But who else? I mean, let's not call people rich or poor. Let's just say people have a distribution of utility.
People with intense preferences in general, they benefit from that system more than.
Yeah, so they're going to benefit in general, but if they're on the losing side of an issue, they'll actually lose the most.
Yeah, that's true.
Right? Whereas very moderate people will actually gain, because they'll gain from the transfers. Right? So it's people who tend to be losing, who would otherwise have won under majority rule, and who are extreme. Right? In principle, from an ex-ante perspective, everyone should gain. So if you didn't know who you were going to be behind the veil of ignorance, you would gain from this, right? Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, Jack.
Question about P.
Yeah.
If I'm an individual voter deciding how many votes to buy.
Yeah.
P is
just as important as knowing my utility.
Yeah.
So I like the analogy to price, to a market, but it seems like in a market we have many repeated interactions that people can learn about prices if they're initially off with it. In a national election, people seem to have a really good idea of what their P is without having voted in this election before. So my big question is, where does information?
Yeah. So I think that. Okay, so first of all, there are like versions of this system that you can implement that would like give people a lot of information about P. So for example, you can run like an auction-like version of this system where P is like estimated by a computer and like gets posted on a screen, and people like so there's like an auction-like mechanism, like a Walrasian auction, where P is the thing that moves around rather than price.
So people are getting information updated as the election is.
But I also, so that's like, we know that in like really big stakes situations that happen really infrequently, that's what we do. But as you said, most markets don't happen that way. People use prices and it's based on sort of repeated interactions. So if you are doing this for many smaller scale things, like people might just get a sense for what P is over time. Or there might be polling organizations that are created that try to estimate rather than who wins or not, what's P, the value of P going to be. Right?
I see that, I think that's one of the avenues for manipulation.
Yeah.
That maybe you don't address as much of this.
Yeah.
That, we could have special interest groups instead of just trying to manipulate you. They manipulate people's perceptions of P.
But the thing is, it's going to be hard to like hide that. So you're going to have to manipulate like a uniform sense of P. And if you get a sense that the interest group is deliberately trying to say reduce P because they're going to try to buy a lot of votes, that would actually raise people's value of P.
Sure.
Because then they'd think, oh, this guy's going to be moving the election the other way. That's actually going to make it closer to being a tie. So.
Yeah. I worry about, really strange outcomes for people in this person.
Yeah. I mean, there are, as I said, there are like auction-like versions of this that you could run, especially in like unusual or large contexts, the same way that in those types of contexts we run auctions.
Okay.
Okay. So you might ask, why in particular should we have the quadratic rule? Why not some other rule? So to think about this, imagine that you had to pay, rather than v squared, v to the power x, right? So still you would get a marginal benefit of p times u from buying an additional vote. But the cost now is going to be the derivative of v to the x, which is x times v to the x minus 1. And Kevin, what would be the first order condition in this case?
So whereas in the previous case we just had that the number of votes in your utility were both proportional to each other,
Yeah.
constant. Now you have x proportional to v to the power of
V proportional to u to the power,
v proportional to u to the power of 1 over x minus 1.
Exactly. So what that says is decisions will be made not based on the average of u, but on the average of u to the 1 over x minus 1. Now notice that's only going to give you efficiency when x is equal to 2. When x is less than 2, then you're going to put more weights on people with extreme utility than on people with moderate utility, right? And when x is greater than 2, you'll put too little weights on the extremes. So another way of seeing this is to think about the externality, right? Remember when we were doing externalities, we had this graph where we added up the cost to you and to other people to get the total cost to society, which would determine the optimum. And the externality you created on the other people was this little triangle there, right? Which is approximately a triangle and therefore approximately quadratic in the amount of cost that the amount that you shift the equilibrium. Okay. In fact, we can relate this system to democracy and other forms of government through the value of x. So as x approaches infinity, everyone is going to buy exactly one vote. And why is that, Sang?
Because your marginal cost will increase infinity.
Exactly. I mean, you can just see it through the first order condition. As x goes to infinity, right, this goes to 0. And so everyone's going to buy utility to the 0 power votes, right? And that becomes just majority rules democracy, right? because everyone, it's one man, one vote. On the other hand, as x goes to 1, what is this going to converge to, Luke?
So if x is 1, then you've got some sort of weird, everyone goes for the border case. So one guy, it'll get weird because the derivative, there won't be an optimal. Like you can't solve for that condition. It'll just, either the equation will hold or it won't hold.
Yeah.
And so if it holds on one side, if it's too high, then you'll put in infinity.
Yeah. So think of what that would be like. You know, it's saying that, okay, maybe it's useful to look at this first order condition. Take the limit as x goes to 1, what's happening?
Your vote should go to k. Well,
No, it should go to 1 over 0.
Oh, sorry.
U to the 1 over 0.
yeah.
So that's stretching out the differences between people with even slightly different utilities, right? And so the idea is in the limit, as you were saying, it's like there's going to be one person who buys an infinite amount and everybody else buys 0, or at least relative to everyone else, that person will buy infinite.
Yeah.
And so that's basically dictatorship of the single individual with the most intense preference, right?
Yeah.
So what you can really think of this as is that x equals infinity is democracy, x equals 1 is dictatorship, and there's a range of other things that are in between, and your problem set actually as you sort of look at this. So you can think of like x between 1 and 2 as sort of being oligarchic, and x between 2 and infinity as sort of being some form of republican government, right? And so, yeah, Albert.
X power 3.
Oh, so yeah, so I mean, you have to actually make this slightly different. It needs to be the absolute value of v to the x power, and then you have to bring in signs and so forth. I didn't want to do all that, so just to simplify notation, I dropped that out. But that's a good point. Okay, so at least since Aristotle, we've been debating about the right forms of government, but because we didn't really have like a mathematical way of representing these things, it was hard to look for the sort of golden mean that Aristotle would have looked for. And I think that in different parts of our society, we use different rules. So like in some parts of politics, we allow lobbying and, people can effectively can buy votes and so forth. And so we have x close to 1, where like the single person who cares the most dominates the issue. And that's all the stuff like that Menker Olson writes about, how organized interests that get people together, what was on your first problem set, for example, take control of the system. In other areas, we have something that's more democratic, and we have x very high and not optimal. But in principle, we should try to have an optimal system where x is equal to 2 on everything. Yeah,
sorry, what was the
Oliver.
author you just mentioned? Olson?
Menker Olson.
Manco.
Yeah, he's like the guy, the problem of collective action.
But don't you mention though that lobbying might be close to quadratic lobbying?
It could be in some cases, but I mean, it's probably unlikely to be in most cases, or at least not systematically. You know what I mean? It could get you closer, at least sometimes, but it would be interesting to actually estimate that empirically. Okay, so despite the prevalence of formal democracy, in practice there's all sorts of workarounds, like log rolling on bills, on committees, and some of these systems might actually have some convexity in them. Jack, can you think of some ways that might work?
Yeah, like lobbying, if I want to convince, 1 or 2 congressmen to go the other way, if they're sort of indifferent, it might not cost that much. But if I want to convince someone who has very strong preferences, or if I want to convince a lot of people, that's going to cost a lot more money.
Yeah. And the first ad dollars, you might have a good idea, it might be more persuasive, and it might be more expensive after that, right? But it's hardly likely to be a precise quadratic form. And, for example, bribes are probably closer to being linear. And I think that's why we decry money in politics often. And yet in other areas we have tyranny of majority. And I think that this is a bit like the world before a formal market economy existed. Kevin, what do you think the analogy is there? So what did exchange and economic relationships look like before formal market economies? Have you ever taken like an anthropology course or?
me, it was like, I'm just trading a pumpkin for a fur or something.
So you had some sort of barter, or maybe you had like gift exchange, right?
Sure.
And what was problematic about those in terms of like allowing an economy to work very well under those rules?
Because basically there wasn't some type of, so it might not be optimal for, like the person who wants to trade, how do I explain this? Like,
Yeah.
so the good that might be available to trade
Yeah.
for what goods you have might not be the one that you in particular want, whereas
Yeah.
a third person might have that, but he doesn't want to trade for what you have.
Yeah, that's a double coincidence of wants problem is what it's
Yeah.
usually called.
Sure.
Yeah, and also like maybe you couldn't trade with people who are very far away because the pumpkins might rot on the way there, right? And you might, not have a relationship that you could trust with people far away. So like, negotiations don't work so well. So, before you had a formalized market economy, the scope of trade was very limited to these small groups that happened to have the double coincidence of wants, etc., right? And I think that basically that is the situation that you're in here, is we can negotiate collective decision problems when we have a small number of people, when they sort of know each other, and the shapes of things happen to be exactly right, but we don't really have a formalized system that allows us to make efficient collective decisions in anonymous large groups. And so I think that quadratic voting can sort of be the equivalent of what a formal market was for private goods allocations for public goods. Okay, so the analysis that I did so far was sort of like a competitive market, because we took the chance of changing the election, the density of pivotality is given. Now I think this is a good first pass, but game theoretic micro foundations are helpful and to actually see how quickly we get to efficiency. And this is the main topic of the technical paper, but I won't bore you with it here. One important insight that comes out of it, though, is that in practice, not everyone is going to buy a very small number of votes that's proportional to their utility. Because if everybody did, right, then it would be overwhelmingly likely that whatever on average people favored would win. And therefore the chance of a tie would be very, very small. It would be exponentially small, because it would be like a normal distribution centered about some point, and then 0 would be far away from that point in standard deviation terms, because the mean gets large relative to the standard deviation, right? And so the chance of a tie would get very, very small. Therefore, the number of votes everyone would be buying would be getting very, very small. And therefore, anyone who disagreed would want to just buy the whole election, right? So there would be like an extreme contrarian, someone who was on the opposite side, who wanted to, for a small amount of money, could buy the whole election. And so how does the threat of such an extremist existing maintain an equilibrium in QV? Can anybody tell me? Yeah, Connor.
Well, because then they would realize that if all the people who supported it, but very small, just bought a very small number of votes, then precisely the contrarian could do this. So they would buy more votes just to
beat the potential of the contrarian existing, exactly. And this keeps things in equilibrium, and in fact keeps the chance of a contrarian existing being very small. Because if the contrarian existed with any decent probability, then everyone would buy a huge number of votes that would totally swamp that contrarian, right? And that's exactly what keeps things in equilibrium.
But doesn't that...
Yeah.
I mean, if I'm the only one to deviate, I'm not affecting much the probability that extreme contrarian buys the election, right? If I don't have intense preferences, I'm not sure I would want to deviate unilaterally to
You don't want to deviate. You want to buy proportional to your utility. But you want to buy with a constant of proportionality, which is sort of roughly equal to the chance that an extremist exists. Because that's the chance that there's going to be a tie in the election, is the chance that the extremist buys the election. Because there's no chance of a tie if there's no extremist, right? And that's what keeps equilibrium.
But if I give a last thought,
Yeah.
given that the contrarian will buy a lot of votes to steal the election, and I'm a single individual,
Yeah.
I only care a little bit, given that I take the other voters as a given, I cannot, either I would have to go up a lot, just...
No, but the extreme contrarian isn't going to buy so many votes that he wins with absolutely probability 1. because that's going to become very expensive to him. I mean, he's buying a huge number of votes, and like the marginal vote's going to be very expensive to him then. So he's only going to buy up to the point where he wins with very high probability.
Yeah.
But given that he does that, everybody else is going to realize that there's a chance that just a little bit they could move him to winning with a little bit less probability. That's going to induce them to buy votes.
Like if you buy 2 votes, but I can like get, without really high cost, I can get from 1 to 2.
Yeah,
Just because that will decrease is probably that much of winning.
exactly. Yeah, Luke.
Wouldn't that bring back the problem, though, of frivolous elections? Because if I know that everyone's going to deal with this contrarian by throwing money at the problem, I generate fictitious contrarians and I generate fictitious elections. And
Well, you have to figure out. So first of all, no one's going to want to be a fictitious contrarian because they're not going to want to pay a huge amount of money in order to do that. But people might fear that there would be, and that would lead people to buy money. So that is a reasonable point, but then you have to just figure out some system for getting things onto the ballot that doesn't allow people to propose frivolous things. So for example, you could require people to buy votes in order to get something onto the ballot, and then they would have to put their money up at stake, so it wouldn't be worth it to them to get the redistribution that came back out of the system. Right? Yeah, Oliver.
Just trying to understand what you're saying here.
Yeah.
So if we had like a normal distribution of voters seated on like non-zero somewhere, and we drawing a fixed number of individuals from
Yeah.
it, as we increase the variance of that distribution, does it make it more likely or less likely? Like, does it make the result more stable or less stable?
It's not. It doesn't depend on the variance. It depends on the tails.
Okay.
So the right question to ask is if you take the Pareto tail of a thick-tailed
And then change the
distribution.
factor on that. Okay.
Yeah, so that's what ends up
And then
depending
the
on it.
answer is-
So the answer is the thicker the tails, the worse, the more slowly you get equilibrium. But also the thicker the tails, the more robust it is to collusion, turns out. So it sort of goes both ways. Because if it's thin-tailed, then like you don't actually need to have that many votes to deter one extremist. But if there were 2 people who got together, then they would totally overwhelm it. You see what I mean? So, yeah, same.
This is kind of a technical question.
Yeah,
If someone buys a lot of votes,
yeah.
is that information public to people?
No, it's private.
But then they're just hedging against the risk.
Exactly.
of the contrary.
Exactly. That's exactly the logic of equilibrium. Yeah, Luke.
is there a clear answer, though, to I publicly and loudly proclaim that I'm buying a very large number of votes. For me and
Yeah.
3,000 of my friends are going to buy a bunch of votes, so don't even bother coming out.
Well,
Don't bother waiting
that's an
for 5
extremely
hours.
bad idea. The reason is that like if you guys are doing that, then the only equilibrium if you guys announce something like that turns out to be that you always lose. Because basically, like you would never want to be doing so many votes, right? So it's not an equilibrium for you to do so many that you win with absolutely probability 1. But if you like as announce that like you care a lot, well then that's going to lead everybody else to think that like you're going to tie the thing up, and that's going to lead everyone to buy a lot more votes, and that's going to bury you guys. So it's exactly the opposite of that actually. So you don't want to do that. Unless the election is ex ante tied. If the election is ex ante tied, announcing something like that could benefit you. But in that case, you want to buy very, very few votes. Because then like the chance of it being a tie is getting smaller and smaller. So that can't be an equilibrium.
But like, what if I really just, like we have many periods, and in the first period I really convinced Will that I'm going to get my way no matter what. Me and 3,000 of my friends were really confident and determined, and we'll blow out how much money the first period to convince everyone that the rest of the periods they shouldn't bother.
Yeah, I mean I can imagine that could potentially be something that you could do, but other people in the future are going to like, if you don't keep doing that, yeah. So, yeah, Donnie.
What if people really underestimate the chance of a contrarian, and a contrarian just wins the system, and then they elect themselves dictator for life or something?
Well, I think if someone proposed a motion that would then be voted on this, so they would become dictator for life, a lot of people would turn out to vote against that.
So wait, every single decision that exists, this is not a republic? This is a...
I don't think it would be a very good idea to like have one vote for president for life, for eternity, that would be determined by this system. Yeah, I don't think that would be a great idea. Anybody else? Okay. Yeah, totally.
Like, would they necessarily maybe publish margins after decisions are made?
Yeah, I'd have to think about that. I'm not completely sure whether that's a good idea, but I think presumably you would. You would do something like that. And you would probably publish something like an estimated value of P as well.
Because then when it comes to like what? Like you don't, like all you have to do is sweep 3 elections in a row. And then it's pretty clear that you're going to keep doing that. And people.
No, but if you sweep by like a large margin, like that's actually.
Oh, it re-incentivizes.
Yeah, exactly. So that's not enough for you to deter people. Okay, so to show the plausibility. What? Yeah.
It is also mandatory voting.
I think. Okay, so I don't know that you would like literally want to like have the government enforce mandatory voting, but it would be mandatory voting in the sense that like you would want everyone to participate,
right.
And so as a result, you would like want to create a civic culture around everyone going to the polls.
Why not mandatory?
You could, but I'm just saying like that's not always the most efficacious. Like they don't always work that well. Like sometimes civic cultures around voting are more effective. Yeah.
Under your system, Glenn, right?
Yeah.
You're giving all the money back lump sum.
Yeah.
Aren't you? So you could just say you only give the money back to people who vote.
Yeah, that's a good way of doing it.
Incentive to vote the epsilon.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Okay, so to show the plausibility of this system, I think it's not enough just to show that it like works in this one situation, because I think the problem with VCG was like all the failures of robustness outside of like the basic way that it works. So I want to like try to go through a bunch of those issues and show how this works better. So there's obviously no budget problem here like there was in VCG, but in principle, collusion could be an issue. And the reason is that it allows you in some sense to get around the squared cost, right? So let's think this through. Imagine that Mitt Romney wanted to buy the presidency, and he has $100 million to devote to this ambition. How many votes would he be able to buy, Oliver?
Square root of 100 million.
What's that? What's the square root of 100 million?
$1 million?
No. 10,000. 10,000, yes.
It's trivial.
So, on the other hand, if everybody else in the population spends on average $1, he would get less than 0.01% of the vote as a result of that. And he can obviously get a lot more than that just by running TV ads. So it doesn't seem like this would be a very effective way of trying to buy the presidency, right? So if instead he could get 100 friends to divide his votes up among, and they would each buy 1,000 votes with that, how many votes could that get him, Connor?
100,000.
Yeah, exactly. So that's still only 0.1%, right? And in addition to that, each of those people who probably is not that rich, or they wouldn't be risking their lives by getting involved in a scheme like this, right, could do a lot better by just running off with the money rather than spending it on the votes, right? And it would be pretty easy for them to get caught. And in fact, if you give some reward for people who ratted out a vote buying, a collusive scheme, it seems like that would be likely to be pretty effective. So I think this shows how the collusion is much less effective than under VCG. You can achieve something by it, but you need a fairly large number of people, and you need to make sure that they don't just run off with the money and so forth, right? Okay. So, of course, these arguments all assume that people are perfectly rational. As you guys probably have heard, it's not all that rational to go and vote at all under the current system because you're so unlikely to be pivotal. So it's a pretty unrealistic way to analyze stuff to assume that people are totally standardly rational in this setting, right? And there's many stories about why people might vote despite the fact that they're very unlikely to be pivotal. And actually, QV not only is robust to these, but actually is more rapidly efficient when you include some of these. So, for example, one reason people might be irrational is that they might overestimate the chance that they're going to swing the election, and that might be why they're voting. And Lancelot, how could people overestimating the chance that they're going to be pivotal actually make QV work better?
Because then you like an incremental change in your intensity of preferences for you to buy more votes.
That's
Like
true, but why would it actually make it work better, right? We said that it works well, but that like there was this problem with an extremist potentially messing things up. How could people overestimating the chance that they're pivotal change that?
I mean, they're more willing to like sort of review the preferences because they think it matters more to the result. I mean, there's.
But how could it help solve the extremist problem?
All the moderates vote for it.
Yeah. So like the whole reason why we needed this extremist, right, is because it couldn't be an equilibrium for by proportional to their utility, because that would lead people to buy too few votes. But if everyone's overestimating the chance of them being pivotal, and they think that it's like not decaying exponentially with a number of people in the population, well then there's no problem, and no extremist will ever be able to come in, right?
What if people overestimate like differently their chance of being pivotal?
Well, if it's uncorrelated with their utility, it wouldn't matter, right? Because, yeah, and even if it was correlated with the utility, you would think it would be, people would overestimate more if they have smaller utility, because that's when there's a lower cost of them overestimating, right? And if that's the case, well then it's even more strongly in the direction of screwing the extremists, right? Yeah, totally.
Doesn't this deal with like what if you, I feel like your learned experiences here will be like sort of, sorry, I'll be but then like, okay, you overestimate your chance of being pivotal and you realize that like the margin is huge, and so next time you're much less likely to be pivotal, right?
But that's fine. Then it just goes towards being rational. Like if people learn, which they obviously haven't in our current system, but if people learn, then you just go towards the rational analysis, which will make this worse, but still efficient in the limit. Okay. How about if people think that there's like a civic duty of showing up to the polls, as we were talking about, but like they're otherwise completely rational? That would be just fine, if not better for us. Winnie, why is that?
I guess kind of for the same reason as the probability
Mm-hmm.
more or less extreme or more likely.
Yeah, and in fact, we were just saying that we would want a culture where people like show up to vote, right? So that's good for us, right? Another reason that people might be more likely to be pivotal than the standard analysis suggests is that there might be aggregate uncertainty about how close to a tie the election is. Tova, why might that make a tie? Imagine people don't know exactly how many people feel which way. How could that make it more likely that there's a tie than this exponential decay thing I was talking about?
So normally you're not sure if it's tie, so then you do go out to vote, right?
Because there's some chance that it could be close to being a tie, right?
Yeah.
Overall.
And here, well, it's the same thing though, isn't it? Isn't this close to the rational explanation now?
Yeah, so this is like a more rational explanation of why people do vote. But it's, so if you have uncertainty about whether like the election's going to be tied or going to be very far from being a tie.
There's bigger uncertainty here with QE, isn't there?
Not necessarily. Well, there might be. I don't know. I haven't actually quantified that. I'm not quite sure how you would quantify it. So actually, in this case, there can be inefficiency in QV. It still outperforms voting in most cases, but there can be a little bit of inefficiency because basically people who, if there's like an ex-ante favorite, if like we think that Bush is likely to win on average, then someone who like thinks Gore, who is in favor of Gore, is going to think more people are like him, and he's going to think that a tie is more likely. And therefore, there's going to be some cases when Bush should win, but Gore will win, because people who are voting for Gore think a tie is more likely than people who are voting for Bush. So there's this like underdog effect. Like, Romney's supporters, right, in the last election, thought that the election was much more likely to be close than the Obama supporters did. And so they would have bought more votes than the Obama supporters did. So there would have been some cases when, like, Obama, like, turns out to have been ahead, but not by that much, when he should have won, but Romney ends up winning.
Isn't this the same thing as this might be circular, but isn't this the same thing as the, like, extremist though? Like, because you're worried that someone might be an extremist, you're wanting to come out and vote? And whereas,
But this creates heterogeneity in that. Like, this creates cases where some people think it's more likely that the election will be tied than other people do. So, okay, so there's also a theory of what's called expressive voting. Yeah, Miles?
Isn't it basically like a lot of those irrationalities stem from the fact that people like the notion that their vote is all equal and that, like, the civic duty comes from the notion that everyone's equal? And, like, a lot of people, I think, probably be turned off with, like, the notion of money in politics being so obvious, like the fact that a bunch of college people can't handle, like, the notion of the true impact of a square root on 100 million, that, like, the general population would just see, like, this guy's spending $100 million, my vote really means nothing now.
Well, so there's a lot of things in what you just said, but let me try to go through them in order. So one thing that you said was that, like, there's like a whole culture around democracy and so forth, and, like, that's what makes it work. And I agree with that. And I think that, like, around this, you'd want to build a culture that, like, deters collusion and that gets people to turn out to the polls and all that sort of stuff. And is that going to be a long, slow process of education and adaptation? Absolutely. It also took about, like, 300 years for democracy to go from being a small experiment in, like, little New England colonies to being the form of government that most of the world uses. And it was a very gradual process of people, like, getting reassured and learning that actually, there's ways to make it work and so forth. So I think that that's absolutely true. But
Do you think it's like a lot more intuitive to say, like, everyone's equal, you all get one vote versus...
Yeah, it's very intuitive, given that you grew up in the United States, learning from, like, the time you were a little child that everyone would be voting. But it wasn't very intuitive to Catherine the Great when there was a revolution in France and, people were marching to her doors saying that they would have, Napoleon wanted to have, you know what I mean? So, okay, so another notion why people might be less than perfectly rational is they might want to express something from their vote. They might just, like, vote because they think they're saying something. And imagine people at a utility proportional to how much utility that they get from changing the outcome that determines how, like, much value they get out of expressing themselves through their vote. How could that make things actually work better, Luke?
So people who care more like putting in more money because that's an expression of how much they care.
Yeah.
So that would mean that people were more inclined to speak up if they cared about it,
Yeah.
which is nice in the sense that way people who care about it speak up. It makes the extremist problem a little worse in the sense that people who care so much will talk really loudly, but that's very expensive. So
no, so actually it makes the extremist problem better, because the fact that everybody else is talking is going to make it incredibly expensive to be an extremist, and will deter them. And even if, like, there's no chance of, like, a tie, it will keep people buying enough votes to deter the extremists, so it will make the extremists show up less.
that would possibly have a small negative effect of the extremists wanting to talk more.
But the thing is that the extremists can't really do that, because the thing is, once everybody else is buying a significant number of votes, like not a trivial number of votes, it's going to be insanely expensive to be an extremist. So they'll never be able to afford it. Yeah, Oliver.
So what are the implications for having a distribution where there are no extremes? And I say this because I was thinking of the...
That doesn't matter. There always turn out to be extremists. So even if you have a bounded distribution, then the, like, little mass that's, like, epsilon close to the lower bound of the distribution will be the extremists.
I was just imagining, if you think of the Romney example, right? There's a point in the distribution where it's going to be cheaper to buy votes in other manners.
Yeah.
Through advertising, whatever political.
Yeah. So, except I don't think that you're going to be able to buy votes as effectively through those other manners. Why is that?
Also, there'll be, like, a fixed cost of buying another vote in those through outside options, and once you've...
Well, but I don't think there will. I don't think that there will be. The reason I don't think that there will be is because, like, the reason why ads can so easily buy votes under our current system is that there's a lot of indifferent people who don't give a damn what's going on, who you can sway by just like running stupid ads.
Yeah.
But if now they have to pay for it, it's going to hardly be worth anything to get those people to buy 1 cent in one direction versus 1 cent in the other direction.
I guess my point is you're going to buy votes until
What?
the marginal
Charities
cost.
advertise. They're trying to induce you to give money to something.
Yeah, and I think that like they're able to achieve a little bit that way, but much less than if people don't really have to put their money behind the things that they're doing.
Maybe.
So, so far, plus I think, a culture would build up around this, I think, which is as averse to people like sort of carelessly spending their money. The same way that like people think in the market economy, it's like stupid if you waste your money on something dumb, and that sort of becomes like part of the spirit of the society. Here, I think it would be a spirit of the society to like think carefully about exactly how much you want to put on things in favor or against, rather than the spirit being just like you have to go out and vote, and like who knows what you should vote for, but just go one way or the other. Yeah, Tova.
And would you think this increase the problems with like the third party problem, the spoiler effect?
So I mean, there's an extension of this to cases where there's like more than 2 candidates, and in that case, it solves the like arrow problem. So you can, and the way that you do is you can buy votes in favor of or against. Okay, so like here's my favorite example. So like think of Hitler's election in 1932. Like he won because if you look at the social science data, there were a lot of people who really didn't want the communists to win, and they didn't know how to express the intensity of their opposition to the communists except by voting for Hitler. And there was a lot of people who like didn't know how to express their opposition to Hitler except by voting for the communists, right? And so imagine you could have bought votes in favor of or against each candidate, and you could express your intensity on all the candidates.
Okay.
I mean, you can sort of start to see how it works.
Okay, that's cool.
Yeah, Oliver.
Just random aside. So in economics, you often hear people
Yeah.
talking about prediction markets.
Yeah.
Do you think like the cost of buying a prediction market should also be quadratic?
Yeah, so on prediction markets, the problem is that people are predicting something, but if they actually think that their prediction will affect any outcome, they no longer have the right incentives. And in fact, this is a real problem. So during the Obama-Romney contest, there was somebody, there was like the price of Romney was like kept quite high, like at like 40% or something, which was like ridiculous, right? Until the last poll closed, but before any information was released, and then suddenly Romney dropped. And like it turns out all the money buying for Romney was coming from like one place, which turned out to be a Romney supporter. He was just buying money to keep Romney's chances up, to keep people going to the polls. So like it just like prediction markets don't work if any decision is based on them. But there's no point of having a prediction market unless the decisions are based on them. So they just don't work as a coherent mechanism for making decisions. So that's why I don't think they're a very good way to make decisions. They're only a good way to literally make predictions. But predictions are useless unless they're useful for decisions. So, okay. So, in many realistic,
Just because I'm from Europe,
Yeah.
I'm from Belgium, where there's like 20 parties in every
Yep.
election.
Yep.
Would it be like, if you vote on every party, would it be like still a single pool of like where you pay and or like would we a pool per party?
So I mean, one way you could do it there is that if you wanted to like have a parliamentary system, people could like put in money to like elect people, and like the number of votes that each party would get would be the sum of the square roots of all the money people put in, and then like the fraction that you got in the legislature would be the fraction of those votes that you got.
Let me see all the negatives.
That would be the idea. And you could also do negatives, yeah. So if you had negatives, if you had negatives, then you wouldn't get any vote, and then you wouldn't get any shares.
What if everyone got negatives though?
What?
What if everyone got negative? Like there are a lot of hateful people who just all, I hate that guy, I'm throwing negative money at him, I hate that guy, I'm throwing negative money. And no one was positive, everyone didn't like somebody. I guess we still get a runoff.
I don't think that I think that's extremely unlikely to be an equilibrium. I mean, you'd have to have a lot of pretty callous people to do
Well,
that.
if it was Hitler and the communists, we would all put negative money at both.
Yeah, but some people would vote in favor of the centrist parties. Yeah.
That would even be better, right? Then you would just encourage like a greater heterogeneity of like political parties.
Yeah, I mean, and in proportion to like the intensity of how people felt about everything.
You
So
also might discipline like extremist parties because they might like one or two votes just for these extremist parties, because
But everybody hates them. You know, that's the thing is, yeah, people would vote negative on them.
You would discipline like
Yeah.
extreme things that
Yeah.
would otherwise go on.
Yeah.
Republicans negative 50 on.
So,
Yeah.
another assumption that I made in the analysis was that nobody knew anything that was relevant to anyone else's preferences. Like everyone knew their own preference, but they didn't know anything that should affect how other people would feel about that. And we know that like in lots of situations, you know, voters might have information that's relevant to everybody and that's in the common good, right? If people had say like just purely common interests, but different information, I haven't fully analyzed this case, but you know, one reason why you should naturally think this would work better is in voting, like the only way you can say I don't know that much is by abstaining. But what if you know a little bit, right? Like this system allows you to say I know a lot, I know a little, and allows everybody to like continuously express that, right?
So the assumption here is that people vote for what they think is good for society?
Yeah, imagine we just all have common interests. We all have the same interest, it's just we have different information. How about if there's if it's costly to acquire information, how do you think that this would compare to standard voting, Jack, in that case?
Well, in standard voting, there's obviously a free rider problem.
Yeah.
In this case, you can invest, you know, because we have the quadratic system, marginal cost equal marginal benefits, so kind of the marginal benefit of you learning more might come more into line with the marginal cost of benefit.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit more calibrated. It still has the free rider problem because if you gain information that's relevant to everyone, then everyone benefits from that and only you pay the cost. But if the information is only relevant to you, it turns out that you have an optimal incentive here, which is not true under voting. Because basically, you're the residual claimant through this system. But actually, you can have an incentive to invest too much in information if it's information that tells you about P. The same way that in like markets, you can have too much of an incentive to like just beat somebody else. Because if you're just learning that like it's likely to be a tie, well then that allows you to like buy more and have disproportionate influence. So it doesn't solve the standard information problems that show up in markets that we solve by IP or through like dealing with, you know, excessive speculation in financial markets, but at least converts things to that relative to the situation in voting, which I think is much worse. Yeah, Tova.
Also, if like because of redistribution, if you're once you're incentivizing voting, you're already going to solve a lot of information problems, right? Like once people are going to vote, they're going to make a little bit more.
Well, maybe. I mean, but the main thing here is that like, you know, in voting, you can only say yes or no. And if the information you're getting isn't going to affect your yes/no decision, you don't care. Whereas here, no matter where you are, you're going to want to invest some in figuring out exactly how much to buy. Okay. The results that I showed also relied on their, well, there's a bunch of other robustness things you could go through in this system. I've already talked to people about this a fair bit, but you know, for example, you can ask what happens with smaller numbers of people. You can extend it to where there's more than just two choices. You can have people set the agenda endogenously. You can also, you know, if you don't want to use real money, you could use an artificial currency. Let me just see where I am in terms of the, yeah. You could use an artificial currency instead, where people can spread the votes over multiple decisions, rather than using actual money if you want there to be some sort of egalitarian thing where every person has equal total influence. You could also, as we were talking about with Jack, have some sort of an auction where there's like a computer reporting the chance of the tie over time. Yeah. Go ahead. Arvid. Yeah.
Like once you like legal to vote, I don't know what it is here, but like 18 or.
Yeah.
But then you will get like this basic like $100 artificial dollars, and you can like Is it that, like, how it goes was for like elections of presidents? Or like-
Yeah, I mean, you could define it narrowly, like each ballot you get $100,
Yeah.
and then there's just like a bunch of different, the presidential, senatorial, whatever. Or you could have it be, yeah, I mean, but you could have it be more over time. And where you draw the line along that spectrum is going to make it more efficient if you make it broader, but it's also going to make it more inequitable because people might waste their money early and they become poor in collective decisions, and then you want to redistribute to the, or.
And then like if
Yeah.
tax it against.
Yeah, Lancelot.
Are you interested in looking at what it gives when you have a risk aversion? So there's
yeah.
that first point that
Yeah.
you've heard like many times, because that
Yeah.
it gives like then more weight to the rich.
Yeah.
But there's also like the strategic issue that like the risk of having an extremist voter. I mean, you know your risk.
Yeah, so when under risk aversion, this does a lot better than something like VCG if you think about it, because the thing is you know how much you're going to pay, whereas under VCG, like if you report something, you're taking a tiny chance of paying a huge amount, and with most of the probability you'll pay nothing. So it does much better under risk aversion than something like VCG does. Okay, so in many, yeah, Donnie.
Do you get any efficiency losses from using the artificial currency instead?
Yes, absolutely. Because you can't allow people who care a lot about public decisions in general to buy the right to have a lot of influence. Like you couldn't allow political scientists to have any more influence than anybody else, or economists, right? Yeah,
You
Tara.
also might have someone really interesting, using that system, you'd have someone really interesting incentives to like manipulate it.
Yeah.
So like I would propose some bill or something to get everyone who would oppose me in some future bill to waste all their votes.
Well, but I mean that's true in money as well. You could try to just get everyone to give you money.
But
You know what I mean?
people who are spending money are earning more money. I don't know. Isn't that usually the part of the problem? Like, isn't that the part of the efficiency?
Well, I mean the agenda setting is going to try to take care of that in general, because I mean you can also do that with money. I mean it's sort of the same. Yeah, Luke.
So how would you address like an issue of like stickiness? So like people don't really think about like small amounts of money, they just kind of do it. So in particular, suppose you have a culture in New York where you just put in $10. That's how much you put into the voting bit. In Chicago, there's a culture of you just put in $5. That's normal. Everyone puts in $5. In St. Louis, you put in $1. Like different places develop different cultures about it. And poor areas develop a culture of $1. And rich areas develop a culture of $10. And it doesn't reflect underlying preferences. It reflects just what's normal.
Well, I mean, I think that you have to develop a culture around this the same way you develop a culture around democracy, which is not just mechanical, it's calibrated. And look, we've got a market economy, but we could develop a culture where everyone acts as if things were rationed. They spend this much on this good, they spend this much on that good, and that's just the culture of what people do. But we don't have that culture, and the market economy only works because we have a culture where people actually think about optimizing and being selfish and all that sort of stuff. So you'd want to try to develop a culture around this like that. You know what I mean?
In the context where we're optimizing, we still have this stickiness,
Yeah, and so the market works imperfectly because of that, but we still think it works better than other allocative systems. You know what I mean? So, okay, so obviously money is as people are starting to get out, potentially makes people uncomfortable. But in corporate governance, people don't feel that way, right? And in fact, within corporate governance, the objections you get to the system are exactly the opposite. Because in corporate governance, people would only get to vote the square root of the number of shares that they have, right? And so in fact, this is a very populist democratic system within the context of corporate governance, where it sounds plutocratic within the system of, and in fact, all the criticisms we get when we propose it for corporate governance are exactly opposite to the criticisms we get when we promote it for democracy. Yeah, Tova.
That's because you're affected proportionally in corporate governance, whereas you're not affected proportionally with voting.
I mean, I don't know. Rich people are affected proportionally more by decisions.
Not proportionally to their vote share, though. Whereas in corporate governance, if I'm affected 12% decision, I get 12% of the decision.
Well, but okay, so if you're trading shares just before a vote, the amount that you're affected is only the square root of the number of. I mean, the shares are a rough sense of how affected you are, But I mean, different people are affected to different extents, and they can, as we said, with 51%, you could just steal the whole company, right? So I mean, there are
Right, but
people.
I'm saying, as in to compare the two, I'm not sure if it's such a natural analogy is all I mean. If only because like people are very populist when it comes to corporate governance because they say it isn't fair that I own.
But the rich people are affected more by collective decisions. I mean, in dollar terms at least, and in dollar terms, the people who own more shares are affected. I mean, rich people effectively have a larger share in society in some sense. I mean, they're contributing more in taxes. Why don't we give everyone votes proportional to how much tax revenue is collected from them?
I'm saying so maybe, but that isn't like that's more comparable to corporate governance.
Yeah, and my point is like, I agree, but for some reason we're used to having one system in corporate governance and we're used to having the other system.
It's much more direct effect, right? Like if I'm not affected by.
I don't think it's much more direct. I mean,
300 millionth of this decision. I mean, like.
Well, but you're affected by proportional to your wealth in dollar terms. I mean,
I'm not voting proportional to my wealth in dollar terms.
I know, and the reason that you're not is because we have a democratic system where everyone assumes we should have one man, one vote.
If you're voting, you wouldn't be voting proportional to your. Oh, I see.
You probably would, because you would care more about the issue if you were wealthier, right? So, basically many of the standard things that like we try to address in corporate governance are addressed by this. Like large shareholders get downweighted smoothly rather than in this really lumpy way that usual minority shareholder protections protect them. But also outside acquirers would have an increasingly hard time as they tried to buy it. They would have an incentive just to make an offer to everyone that makes everyone better off rather than trying to potentially screw the current people, right? Anyway, so there are applications to corporate governance, to the assembly of public goods, to these big public decisions and social choice problems. So in the long term, I'm hoping that this is a novel way of sort of organizing society. But as everyone has pointed out, there's going to be a lot of familiarization, people getting used to this, people believing that it will actually work, and developing the system itself to make it ready to apply to all these things. Because of course it requires developing a culture around it. It requires people understanding it and interacting with it in a way that makes sense to them. And so we have to, I think, start small and then build out from there. So right now, actually, there is a team of students who is building an application for the Mobile App Challenge here at Chicago that will do this for honors and hiring committees using no money. So like a system where you, like for example, think of the Academy Awards. There, everyone gets one vote on every issue. But of course, the screenwriter should have more say on the screenwriting. But you also want other people to have a little bit of say, and this would allow everyone to determine exactly how much say they should have. Hiring committees are sort of a similar issue. Book groups, scheduling, there's many different applications, and as a result, Eric Posner and I have started a company that's trying to develop software around this. And in fact, students from some of these classes have gotten involved in this. The basic ideas are public, but the implementation is proprietary. And if you're interested in using this, hopefully we'll soon have some software online. And we plan to use these to learn and improve, and to eventually commercialize this to bring in revenue that we can use to continually improve data that we can use to learn, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So this is one example, I think, of how economics can really change how you think about a big social problem. But more broadly, throughout the course, we've had a back and forth between sort of economic paradigms and applications in the real world. And I just want to remind you of the breadth of questions that we've covered. So we talked about the impact in trade that transportation can have on development. We talked about mechanisms for allocating courses to students, about optimal carbon taxation, about the regulation of insurance, about the regulation of product design and price discrimination, about how price discrimination can teach us about optimal auction design and criminal justice. We talked about innovation policy, about the control of mergers and competition policy, about optimal income taxation, new ways of collective decision making today. And in all of these areas, I think you now are sort of an economic expert. You have something distinctive to say on a range of public policy questions that will mark you as a person who's able to reason like an economist. We also explored many fundamental trade-offs that govern these areas, and I'm hopeful that you now have a better, more nuanced, and less ideological understanding of these types of areas. We tried to quantify and disaggregate some of these trade-offs between socialism and capitalism. The trade-off between internalizing externalities and providing public goods against the distortions that come with existing public decision-making mechanisms and the difficulty of aggregating information. The benefits of redistributing income against the reduction in incentives that those have. We talked about regulation and prizes as a more efficient way of incentivizing people to innovate, but the reduction in the ability to exploit information that entrepreneurs have in that process. We talked about competition policy and how that can improve static efficiency but reduce economies of scale. And of course, not all of these trade-offs between planned economies are really the same or depend on the same factors. And as a result, I hope you won't just package together in the standard ways that the left and the right do in the United States different economic issues, but realize now that there are many different economic issues, each of which turns on the relevant information for that problem, the relevant elasticities to that problem, and that this course has gotten you to think about public policy questions, about social policy in a fundamentally, differently arranged way than you would have thought about it in this standard left-right lineup. Okay, so I think this brings us to sort of the end and what all of this means to you guys. So I'll just tell you a personal story that led me to become an economist. So in the summer of 2005, I worked for a hedge fund at the height of the finance boom. And I helped them develop a trading strategy that we made a bunch of money on, but that seemed to me socially destructive. Basically, we arbitraged between two sides of a market, and in both markets, consumers were really confused about what they were buying and taking on all sorts of risks that they shouldn't have been taking on. And we sort of helped make that market work. And in the process, I think, made a lot of people worse off while making a lot of money ourselves. So I asked my boss, what was the social value for which we were rewarded with, $100 million or whatever. And he said, ours is not to question why, ours is just to do and die. And that was the summer after I had taken an economics course, and I had dinner with my economics teacher that summer. And I asked him, about this trade, and he said, look, if you become an economist, your job will be to question why. And that's sort of the genesis of me becoming an economist. And, I think more broadly, most people, their economic role is to go about their daily concerns, to maximize given the system that has been set up for them. And there's sort of like this big machine that they're, a little cog inside of that's running, and they're, doing their part within the system. But you need somebody who has the role of stepping back and seeing whether the machine's working at all or not. As a society, we have gotten wealthy enough that we can afford to have a small class of people whose job it is to ask whether the machine is working well. And to me, it's an incredible privilege to be part of that small group of people who asks those questions. Because to me, there's no questions really that are writ larger across the face of history than how do we organize our society. These are questions that people have been asking for thousands of years and will keep asking as long as mankind doesn't manage to destroy itself. And you might say, well, maybe these ideas that we have, maybe these things we come up with never change policy. But to me, everybody thinks that they know how to make policy better, all the presidential candidates, whatever. And much of the time they don't really understand even the most basic things about the consequences of the things that they're prescribing. And to me, there's a tremendous amount of pleasure in just seeing how the world could be better. And maybe in the long term, just being able to see that can have an impact. If you went back to Athens and you asked people what was the most important things going on, they would have said, oh, well, there was this war with, Persia, and now Pericles is going on an embassy to make peace with Sparta and so forth. And people would have said, well, what about this crazy guy who's walking around the streets of the city asking people what the meaning of life is, and is it right for them to... And they'd say, well, look, everyone has their entertainers and their, obscurantists, but that guy has no influence on anything that's going on. And 2,000 years later, only people who take a course on, Greek history know who Pericles was. But everyone knows who Socrates is, and he's the basis of the society we live in now. So ideas have a long gestation period, but in the end, I think they're the only thing that really rules the world. So I hope you guys will consider, joining the life of ideas in shaping how we think about the way the economy works. So, thanks.